All right. Welcome everyone out there to the Clean Start Perspectives today. I'm Thomas Hall, Executive Director of Clean Start, and we've got a great discussion for you today. It's something that everyone's kind of talked about in every single distributed energy resources, microgrid discussion, and that is V2G. But first, I want to thank who we're supported by, and that is SMUD, our local utility, Bloom Co-working. That's where you can find us doing work here in Sacramento. Fresno State, the Wet Center, we're part of the CEC Innovation Cluster. Microgrid discussion. And River City Bank and Chico Start. They support what we do and they make these podcast discussions possible. Now, I'd like to welcome our two guests. We have Kacy Marrs and Vanessa Fiore. They have been doing vehicle to grid projects in California, Canada, and I believe other places across the country. So I brought them in as experts to tell us about what really goes on in vehicle to grid and how these projects are developed. Some of you might recognize Kacy as a regional Sacramento entrepreneur who built electric bikes, cool electric bikes at that, with the goal of making transportation more accessible to people. And Vanessa Fiore, while she is from Canada, which in California or in the United States, we like to refer to as America's hat. But in all fairness, they refer to us as the Pantaloon de Canada, which if you want to translate that, you can figure it out. But she's been working on vehicle to good up there and also has a background in CalFarts, which is anaerobic biodigestion, and has been an advocate at the Citizens Climate Lobby, who is very active here, focusing on putting a price on carbon. And with that, I want to quickly kind of outline some stuff today on vehicle to grid as we're going forward. And that is vehicle to, well, it's still a lot of things. It's vehicle to grid, vehicle to home, vehicle to load, vehicle to integration, vehicle to everything. Yes, it is a distributed energy resource, which means it's part of the future of accessing renewables that are intermediate and enabling people to sell services across the grid. And with that, I'm going to let Kacy Marrs take over and give his presentation, and then we'll go into our discussion.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here and talk about V2G. I created a presentation. I had a V2G presentation I was originally going to provide today or present today. But unfortunately, Vanessa and I were furloughed from Lion here a few weeks back. So I kind of created my own slides from old photos I was able to find. So I wasn't going to share any kind of proprietary Lion slides since I'm no longer with the company. They say we're going to come back in 6 months, so hopefully that's the case. But in the meantime, I'm going to share some personal slides and then some other V2G slides and also introduce Vanessa as well. Thomas, I'm on my older Mac, so I'm having some kind of technical difficulties here. I emailed you the slide deck.
I've got it. I will share them.
Awesome. That would be great. Thanks.
All right. There you go. Tell me when to click.
Yeah, so you can go to the next slide. So I started actually building custom electric bikes out of my garage in Costa Mesa around 2007. This is the very first bike I was commissioned to build. It was for James Hetfield of Metallica. I did a cherry wood veneer on the battery box and kind of a cherry wood inlay. Go to the next slide. This is a customer in Thailand, circa 2013. Next slide. This is the bike I actually recently finished. This goes about 70, 75 miles an hour. I haven't clocked it yet. But I'm starting, these bikes are starting to transition more into motorcycles. You can kind of see I did a polished aluminum battery box. It's kind of a cool effect. So starting to build faster. My passion, I grew up riding motorcycles. So my passion's motorcycles. My bikes are starting to go a lot faster. Next slide. This is what is one of the components that's allowing my bikes to go faster. To my knowledge, this is the only brake rotor of its kind on the market. I had to basically design a custom free floating rotor to mount to the hub motor to be able to make my bikes go this fast and stop safely. Next slide. And this is a design. Actually, after I got furloughed, I spent a few hours. These are all parts I had laying around. And I had some tubing already rolled for my previous design. I actually ended up buying a 1-inch die for the smaller tube roll you see on the bottom. But this is a design idea I've had for several years now. It's more of a traditional setup using a lot of the same parts that I have been using. So at some point, I'm going to start developing this. This is going to be a full-on motorcycle, kind of. It's basically a beach cruiser for the highway. Next slide. I actually first heard of V2G back in 2016. This is my buddy Chris and I. We were contracted $50,000 to build an all-electric Honda Insight. We ended up working with AC Propulsion, the president, Tom Gage. He was the one that actually introduced Elon Musk to Martin Eberhard and the early Tesla investors. Alan Cocconi was the founder of AC Propulsion. That's actually what AC stands for. But it was really cool. We used the early powertrain for the Tesla Roadster. You can see the analog motor controller under the hood there. So it was a really cool project, but working with Tom Gage and his engineering team there, they supplied the motor controller, the batteries, and the motor. But he first started telling me about V2G back in 2016, that analog motor controller had V2G capabilities. So it was really cool having discussions with him all the way back then. The main issue at the time was kind of still the issue we're facing today is safety, grid safety. These grids weren't designed to accept energy back onto the grid. They're only designed to dispense energy. So we are working with utilities to overcome those hurdles. But even back then, that was like one of the major, hurdles that were preventing actual V2G technology for, becoming mainstream. Next slide. This is the back of that car. You can see aluminum. I had to weld an aluminum kind of frame to drop the batteries in. You see one set of batteries in the bottom there, and then we stacked another set on top. That was a custom air duct. I had to fabricate all the batteries were air cooled since they were. This was like early technology, 07, 08. So all air cooled batteries. Next slide, please. This is that analog motor controller I was talking about. It was a crazy science project. And that's where Tesla first realized they can't mass produce the Tesla Roadster, right? One of the first things they had to improve was going digital with the motor controllers. But this thing is crazy. And this is the motor controller that does have the V2G capabilities in it. Next slide, please. And I want to introduce my colleague that worked at Lion with me, Vanessa Fiore. She kind of was in charge of V2G in Canada. So welcome, Vanessa, and take it away.
Thanks, Kacy, for the intro, and big thank you to Clean Start and Thomas for having us today. So yes, like Kacy, I was also an employee at Lion who got furloughed. I'm Canadian. I'm born in Toronto area, and I'm currently based out of Ottawa. I actually never heard of Canada being known as America's hat, so that was pretty funny. And at the time when we were working at Lion, Kacy was kind of the minority in our group because it was all French Canadians and then myself and then 3 Americans. So that was pretty funny. But yes, so that's just a picture of me in Lion 8, I believe. And that was at a conference in Toronto. So I've been working at Lion. I did work at Lion for a year and a half. And I was hired on as a project manager, where I was working in electrification and specifically mostly in V2G projects. I have a background in environmental science. I studied at the University of Ottawa, and ironically, my Bachelor of Science was more specialized in conservation biodiversity. So I was really interested in biology. And Kacy knows I do citizen science work on the side. I also do advocacy work as well. Like Thomas mentioned, I am a volunteer at Citizens Climate Lobby. We have a chapter up in Canada. And I actually attended the national conference in Washington, D.C. 2 years ago now, and everyone was really confused as to why there was a Canadian there. But it was really nice meeting everyone from across the US who wants a carbon pricing system in place because it promotes projects like these and adoptions like electrification and vehicle electrification, specifically for medium and heavy duty electric vehicles. So like Kacy mentioned, I did a lot of the work in Canada. So I managed a couple of our V2G projects in Canada, as well as managing relationships with some of the other stakeholders in the US that Kacy and I worked on. Next slide. So as I mentioned, I have my background in conservation and biodiversity. However, I did have a little stint in the biogas industry. So this was actually a design that I made when I was 18 with my friend who was just starting architecture school. So we made this on AutoCAD. I know it looks kind of elementary with all these funky colors, but we wanted to make sure we differentiated the different components of this biogas system. And what made it unique was that we wanted to develop our own micro anaerobic digester, which instead of it being a large scale facility, we wanted to sort of manufacture and design these smaller systems that we can put outside of grocery stores, shopping malls, that they can then manage their waste directly. So I actually got into this because when I was 18, I was still in high school. I applied for a grant through the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. And it was for the Youth Innovation Challenge, it was called. So it was for anyone between the ages of 18 and 24 if they had a sustainable idea to help solve an environmental issue, that they could submit it and win a grant. And we ended up being one of the winners. Actually, the other winners during the same year, they were also from California, and they started their own cookie business out of food waste, which was cool. So it was kind of like a food waste theme that year. But yeah, we ended up developing an MVP, a minimum viable product. But it was so we just got an IBC tank, a couple PVC pipes, and then started testing with cow manure, because that's essentially what anaerobic digestion is. You take cow manure and methanogens, which is the bacteria within them that essentially take organic matter, break it down, and then produce methane gas, which you can then put it into a combined heat and power system and produce energy. Or you could put it directly into a boiler as heat with some filtration involved. So yeah, that was sort of what got my entrance into the energy industry. And that's kind of made my case for how I got into Lion, because I sort of did a combination of, okay, biogas work. I was in the industry for a couple of years. After I realized it would be really expensive and difficult to build my own, I found other companies who already had an existing prototype and were trying to scale. And then I started working sales with them. And I was also simultaneously working conservation jobs as well. So it's kind of all over the place when it comes to, my work. But that's sort of what laid the foundation for me to get into electrification and utility work at Lion, which was primarily what I did. It was less about the vehicles and more about what are the capabilities that they could do when it comes to vehicle to grid discharging and the potential in that. So I worked alongside my boss at the time, Christopher Ralph, and he was a huge visionary in this technology, and I'm excited to talk about it and sort of his vision as well in this podcast. But yeah, next slide. And yeah, to my point of the CEC, this was that's Catherine McKenna in the middle. She was the former Minister of Environment and Climate Change at the time. That was me when I was 18. And then that's my best friend, Adam, when we worked together on this project. So yeah, sort of just a snapshot of the grant that we won, and we flew out to Prince Edward Island to present the idea on our micro anaerobic digester, which was super cool. We called it small scale waste to energy at the time, which wasn't super creative. So we ended up changing the name later. But yeah, it just kind of showcases that you can get into the industry at no matter what age, as long as you sort of have a vision and a passion for it, I think is really encouraging. So yeah, next slide.
Yeah, so to tie back into the V2G, Chris, who Vanessa was referring to, he actually hired me almost 3 years ago. He also hired Vanessa. But when we were talking, I mentioned some of these projects I worked on, and specifically, I mentioned V2G in the interview, and he got really excited because he didn't know anybody else that knew what V2G was even. So yeah, he was the visionary for V2G. He was really getting into grid integration. So hey, can you come help us with that? And hey, I'll be happy to. So that's kind of how I got started with Lion as well. I was project manager for the US, also charging sales manager. So I sold the hardware, partnered with the utilities, partnered with the software companies. We had a whole grant team I worked with to go after funding through either state or federal funding. So that's kind of what I've been doing for the last few years. This is a picture I took at the Argonne National Lab. I was there to do a V2G seminar. I did a presentation and I sat on a panel with Nate Baggio. He's one of our VPs there in the picture with his hands behind his back. But they were doing basically V2G testing using one of our buses. And Vanessa kind of worked on that project as well. Vanessa, you want to add anything?
Yeah, so they actually did a pilot test. It was the first of its kind on a Lion vehicle, and they used their spec module. So basically, sort of imitates a charger. It's not actually, but it's designed to imitate it. And so that way, it was able to test Lion's capacity and being able to discharge back onto the grid, and it was successful, which was super exciting. So again, it was the first of its kind, especially with an organization like Argonne National Labs. So it kind of paves the way in future projects as such, and being able to work not just with fleet operators who obviously acquire the vehicles, but also with utilities. It requires sort of a large, broad scale partnership that I know we're going to get into sort of later, and we'll talk about some of the partnerships involved. But yeah, it was a really exciting feat that was achieved.
Yeah, they built their own charger as well, which was pretty interesting. There were also engineers from the Idaho National Lab that were at that event that I started working with as well. I sold them a 60 kilowatt Borg Warner DC V2G charger that they set up, and their team was specifically tasked at cybersecurity on the V2G side. So that was an interesting project to be involved in. They actually were having some technical issues after I got furloughed, so I had to reach out to them. We're having some 10 amp current limit issues, I believe, on the ISO 15118-2 charging standard. If anybody's into any of that, so. But yeah, that was some great partnerships there. This is a picture. Well, the one before this, yeah, that was a picture that I took. I went down to Oakland several times. This is Zoom. They were doing a V2G trial. That's Palav there doing the raising his hand, and we were actually doing a V2G trial here. They had EV Gateway, and they were working with TELUS, a 40 amp TELUS there. Next slide. This is just a picture of the 40 amp TELUS. I had to go back and look find a lot of my old pictures to kind of present this slide, because like I said before, we had something completely different that I was going to present. But Thomas said, hey, how about you just come back on and anyway, and kind of talk about your experience. So that's kind of what we're doing. Next slide. This was the charging setup that they had. This wasn't hooked to the grid, although they were working with PG&E to get to that stage. If you can see here, they had a heater as a load. So they were drawing energy out of the battery and using the heater as the load just to make sure that all the protocols worked and they were actually able to send energy back through the charger. Next slide. One of my largest actually, the Lion's largest U.S. infrastructure deal to date was one I closed with our grant team in partnership with the California Energy Commission. So I partnered with our customer was American Transportation. He's a private bus owner in Long Beach, and partnered with Borg Warner Fermata to deploy 20. There were actually 23 125 kilowatt CPU actually dispensers, and 21 125 kilowatt CPU units. So we did like a 21 to 23 ratio CPU to dispenser. If you know anything about the Borg Warner hardware, you can have 5 dispensers per one CPU unit. So we won $3 million. So we wanted to get the biggest bang for our buck when it comes to V2G. So I did a 1-to-1 ratio. Although you can have 5 dispensers on one CPU unit, you can only do V2G at one vehicle at a time. You can't do it simultaneously. Borg Warner is working on that, from what I understand, but the current technology, you're limited. But because we won so much funding, we did a one CPU unit to one dispenser. So a lot of big hardware being installed in Long Beach. We're going to put close to 2.5 megawatts of power back onto the grid. So a really exciting project. I was happy to be a part of. Next slide. And this is just a picture of the hardware, the 125 kilo, or this is actually a 60, I believe, but just a picture of the hardware. You can see the CPU unit and then the dispensers on the left. But that's all those are all the slides I have. I know we can get into questions and go into some of these projects in more depth. But yeah, I just wanted to put something together to give us some kind of structure for the conversation, considering the circumstances.
Well, I think that was an excellent introduction. V2G, well, I mean, grid communications and, load management is something that's been going on for a long time, but vehicle to grid is something that, is still relatively nascent and something that could really impact some people's lives. So it's good that we've got a lot of, younger energy going in and addressing this. So one of the questions I had, so like you're going to do a vehicle to grid project. What are all the players in a vehicle to grid project? I imagine you have, the bus OEM and whoever owns it. Who else do you have in a grid project?
Yeah, the main player, like I kind of mentioned in my talk, is the utility, right? You have to have software and hardware on the vehicle able to, send energy back from the vehicle. And that's why we're mainly doing DC versus AC. There's other issues involved in AC V2G versus DC, and on fleet vehicles, we're just charging DC anyway. So yeah, that communication between the vehicle and the utility, and then the middle player is obviously the charging hardware and then the software as well. So all of those things have to communicate to be able to send energy from the vehicle, back to the utility. And that's why on that project in Oakland, we had EV Grid and we had another EV Gateway, I believe. There were 2 different software companies. I'll have to go back and look at my notes. But two different software companies partnering to be able to make this happen with the TELUS hardware. And then obviously our bus. I was actually on site with the vehicle tech. We had to do a wiring harness replacement and a software update on PySnoop, which was one of the vehicle softwares we were using, just to enable to the vehicle to be able to send energy back, because they were using one of the older first or second gen. I think it was a second gen Lion C bus. So that bus didn't necessarily have the capabilities. All the buses coming off the line now do have V2G capabilities, but because they were testing on an older bus, we wanted to make sure it could work and had to do an on-site wire harness swap and software update.
So we've got the utility, the bus owner, the OEM. What about like the location? Do you have to have different like location agreements or any work in there?
Yeah, that comes with the interconnection agreement with the utility. So kind of in every utility is different, right? So that just throws additional challenges in, right? California is obviously progressive. So there's pretty much most all the major utilities in California. There's some small ones that I never heard of until I started working with Lion. But most of the major utilities have make-ready programs and funding and steps, and the interconnection agreements in place to be able to implement V2G fairly easily. When you start going back east, some utilities don't want to mess with V2G. Some, have heard of it and they want to kind of start testing, but they haven't really done much work or research into it. So it really changes as you go kind of across the nation. And I'm sure it's kind of the same way in Canada.
What have you noticed when you've looked at projects that, Kacy's worked on and that you've worked on. What are the similarities and differences?
Hmm, that's a good question. I think across the board, sort of involves the same sort of partnerships, right? So you kind of mentioned it, Thomas. You have the utility, you have the OEM. So Lion in this case is who we were working with. You have the fleet operator, so the company who owns the buses and who operates the buses, and then you also have the software developer. So usually we worked with Fermata, we worked with Synop. Um, just to name drop a couple. So those are the main ones that we worked with in Canada and in the US as well. And then we also have the charger manufacturer. So normally we worked with Rhombus, so Borg Warner, but recently we started working with TELUS because there were some projects involved. So yeah, sort of a lot of those same synchronicities of who needed to be involved in the project was very similar in both Canada and in the US. I feel like the US was probably a little bit more ambitious with their pilot projects in terms of the number of buses that they use. So in California, San Diego, SDG&E, as well as Cajon Valley School District in San Diego, they had 7 buses that they were piloting, and they were all Lion Cs. So they used 7. And then I know in New York, there was White Plains School District. They had around 5. In Canada, we've only really tested with 1 or 2 buses. So I feel like in the US, they have more of a bandwidth in terms of testing with more buses. And we've also been doing the projects for much longer in the US. So Cajon Valley, that one started in 2019. White Plains started in 2018. In Canada, the only recent project that we actually got off the ground and did was in BC. So that was a partnership between Coast to Coast Experiences, and they actually have operations in Seattle and New York as well, New York City. So they just did 1 bus, 1 charger. And then we also have another project that's going on in Prince Edward Island. And that one only has 2 buses, 2 chargers. So I feel like the US is a little bit more ambitious. That's one difference.
I
But
hope
a similarity in terms of challenges, I would say, are that there's not really any sort of uniform standard or policy when it comes to V2G. So what OCPP or Open Communication Protocol is to be used on what standard. So for example, there's been several iterations of V2G communication. So ISO 18118-2 was sort of the first one, sort of the demo, and then it sort of evolved into 2022. So Lions buses, they had certain standards that they were able to access at. But the most recent one we weren't able to utilize OCPP with, like that's still being tested right now. So that could be difficult with utilities as well, because if there's not really a standard and they're all doing sort of like one utility in this area in this city is doing, on this standard, and then another one is doing it on another standard, that could be sort of challenging to synchronize a little bit. We found. So I feel like that's one sort of similarity between them is they're all operating on different standards and OCPPs.
so. Who are I guess, the main kind of players in the vehicle to grid space? And we're going to focus on kind of, I guess, the electric kind of fleet, heavy duty buses. There's Lion Electric. What are some other manufacturers of heavy duty electric vehicles that might be vehicle to grid?
I mean, I know Ford on the residential side. I have a lot of friends that have been approached from Ford to do it on the residential side. I just get a lot of questions too on the AC side. But yeah, as far as fleet goes, that's a good question, because I know Tesla is kind of shying away from V2G, although their early powertrain had that. They're going the way of the Powerwall, so they're kind of getting into more. They would rather their game plan is stationary storage versus using vehicle batteries. Yeah, Vanessa, do you know any other large fleets?
Yeah, so Thomas Built is one of them. Bluebird is another one. The thing that differentiated Lion from them though is Lion is it we have a purpose-built chassis. So like our buses are from conception, they were always electric, but now with Thomas Built, with Bluebird, they're actually just kind of retrofitting their existing models that were diesel or gas to then become hybrid or electric. So I don't know how advanced those companies are in terms of testing for V2G. I know Lion was one of the sort of pioneers because of the fact that it's chassis built purpose, or purpose-built chassis, sorry, of electric vehicles and BESBs. So I know we were working on some projects with Thomas Builds and Bluebird where they were kind of testing all of our buses together, but those haven't really been realized yet. Those are still kind of in the works.
Yeah, I know Bluebird was working on some projects. I wasn't aware of Thomas, but I was thinking also other OEMs, like Nikola. I'm not sure, as far as the truck side, because we have our 6, our 8. But that's a good point. Vanessa mentions we are kind of more like Tesla in that way. When Tesla first started, they tried to retrofit a Lotus body onto their platform, and they realized it's easier just to build it from the ground up, and that's where the Model S came from. But yeah, we've kind of done that on the bus side as well, where you look at a lot of these classic style buses, and they just basically retrofit their original chassis. But as far as the ISO standards, one of the challenges, going back to what Vanessa was talking about, the CEC deal that we closed, they required us to operate off the new -20 standard, and Lion had been operating off the -2 edition 2 at the time. So yeah, just a lot more software development that goes into just the project. A lot more heavy lifting to get up to those additional standards. We can make V2G work on certain standards. But from what I understand, the new -20 standard is the new V2G updated standard, and that's obviously why they wanted us to use it.
What are some of the cost drivers when you're doing these projects? We've had discussions around, electric vehicle charging where it's a lot of the soft costs and kind of retrofit costs. So aside from those, on a vehicle to grid project, what are the, I guess, the cost drivers? What increases the cost? Where's a place where maybe cost could be saved?
Yeah, hardware would be the biggest, right? V2G, I've been with Lion for almost 3 years, right? When I first got on with Lion, as we were talking about with Chris, V2G still was it wasn't even a thing yet, right? Even up to 3 years ago, no one was doing it. We had a few test pilots, but as far as talking to customers and saying, hey, we can implement this, we were very wary of that, right? Up until fairly recently, within the last year. So cost has been a huge issue when it comes to hardware, and OEMs developing V2G capable hardware. We've been very limited on our options, and Borg Warner, they're 60 kilowatt or 125 kilowatt chargers. Most school districts, we have a lot of school districts that buy 24 kilowatt DC chargers just because they're most cost effective. My customer, American Transportation, was not a school district. He was a private business owner. So it made sense for him to go big for the additional revenue because he owned the batteries, he owned the buses. So it really made sense for him to go after that funding. But most school districts, the additional funding to install a Borg Warner 60 or 125 kilowatt versus a 24 kilowatt DC wall box, it's a substantial amount of money up front. The funding with the CEC helped justify that in this case. But right before we were furloughed, I was helping our vehicle team apply to ZESB. It was one of the new programs for school replacements. And they had, this is the first time I saw it on a grant other than the CEC one. They had AC. I forgot how much the AC charging was for. The DC charging was pretty good, but they had I think it was $95,000 per charger for V2G hardware if you were willing to implement V2G hardware. That's a substantial amount of money, right? So I was really excited about that opportunity because I was really going to push V2G on all these school districts, especially obviously in California where we're going to be deploying, these potentially $95,000 chargers. That would for sure cover hardware, software, and install, most likely.
That's exciting because, like, I know the Twin Rivers here in Sacramento, which was one of the first ones to have electric school buses, has wanted to do, vehicle to grid. And I think just recently, Oakland, their school district is, I think, now all electric and doing vehicle to grid. Now, I kind of understand the huge value proposition of school districts with these buses with giant batteries that are only used, 2/3 to 3/4 of the year and also aren't used all throughout the day of helping, move load. Any interest on vehicle to grid from fleets? You mentioned you had, a customer with a private customer. Um, they like to run their things a lot. What's the kind of value proposition? Are they interested in this heavily, or how do they look at it? How's it different from school buses?
You talking about like truck fleet owners,
Truck
or
fleet owners, like let's say Amazon, UPS, or USPS.
it all kind of depends on their business case. Some a lot of truck fleet owners, well, some run 24/7, right? So there's not really any kind of dwell time to be able to take advantage of utilizing V2G. School buses make the best case because they sit for the three of the hottest months of the year where everybody's running their AC, right? And those are assets. Those are $300,000-$400,000 assets just sitting there. Portable power walls with up to 200 kilowatts of battery. So that's why schools make so much sense when it comes to V2G. We were starting to get into a little bit of V2G with our truck fleet side. Trucks in general, just the selling of electric trucks is a little behind buses. I think if you look at Lion's business, the majority was buses. We're still trying to develop our line 6, our line 8. We had a semi that came out. So it really just depended on the use case of the business, but the schools do make a lot more sense. But there were some truck fleet owners that I was talking to that were definitely interested. Some charging depots. So a lot of charging depots, these companies will come along kind of charging as a service, and they're deploying X amount of big DC chargers in a certain area off a highway. I've had those conversations for V2G, but nothing past that for trucks.
Now I wanted to quickly call on Carl Lennox to see if he had any comments on I guess the value proposition for different groups on vehicle to grid, if you're willing, Carl.
Oh, sure. Put me on the spot a little bit, but that's fine. Yeah, I mean, I think
100% on the spot. You did not know I was going to ask that.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know me, which probably is a lot of you, I'm with Sunrun, and I've been involved with our Ford program with vehicle to home, and now vehicle to grid. And I think just speaking about what we've announced publicly. We are in the course of doing a pilot with Baltimore Gas and Electric, small pilot. We're actually unlocking kind of the V2G capabilities of that equipment for real customers in real life, which is cool. I think we're the first. I think it's the first pilot of that kind in the U.S. I think that what we find is that the value proposition, obviously, very much depends on like what programs exist to allow customers to take advantage of the fact that they're dispatching energy to the grid. That's not common. So there's a couple of pilots or a couple of pilot programs in different utilities. But there isn't sort of a formal rate making that's been completed, which would allow customers to get remunerated for dispatch. And there's kind of like, I'd say there's sort of two levels to that, right? One is being connected to the home, so operating in parallel with the grid in a non-export kind of a mode, is relatively straightforward from like a regulatory and tariff perspective, because then you can kind of just treat it like a battery, like a standalone battery, where you have treatment of standalone batteries. That's a big caveat. Where things get really interesting is when you say, hey, well, actually, we want to be able to export across the meter from that asset, which is where a lot of the value actually comes from. And that's something that hasn't been fully worked out, because the only real precedent for exporting across the meter is with solar. And so there's that interconnection policy and kind of the net metering policy and tariffs are very tied together in a way that's proven to be complex to tease apart. So we're not quite there yet. Maybe I'll pause there. That's kind of where things are at.
That's a good pause. Everything's waiting on someone to, I guess, make a strong case for it. So I know there's been federal funding going out for school bus EV conversion and some for vehicle to grid. Have you guys seen, Kacy and Vanessa, have you guys seen that going out? Is is Canada also providing similar incentives or?
Yeah, ZETF. Were you going to talk about that?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah. So sorry, I wasn't sure. So, I mean, we're in Canada, we're fortunate. That's a stretch. It depends on which jurisdiction you're looking at. Some governments work faster than others, I want to say. So a lot of Lion's work in terms of its funding was contingent on the Zero Emission Transportation Fund, or ZETF. I found while we were working at Lion, there were the two major grants that we were applying to. So it was ZETF in Canada and a lot of EPA in the US, on the US side. So a lot of them just sort of offer these financial incentives or subsidies on the vehicles. So for example, the one ZETF grant that we won was with Langs, which is in London. Their service area is London, Ontario. And that was for 200 electric school buses, which I mean is really great. We had a lot of other applications out for other projects that involved 1,000 school buses for one fleet operator, for example. So that's one of them, is the federal government. So ZETF being the biggest. Natural Resources Canada also had some funding opportunities as well. I know one was called the On-Road Decarbonization Program. So the feds and then also the provincial governments were huge. So in our pilot project in BC, for example, they took subsidies from some of the funding that the utility had to offer. So what BC Hydro, they had some funding that they were able to use for pilot project and experiments related to V2G or just grid stabilization in general. So they use that. And then also the provincial government in BC, they sort of have their own financial incentives in place. I did most of my work in Ontario, so I know the IESO, they had the Grid Innovation Fund, that was one. They believe that was the main one. They don't really have any, so it all depends on the government as well, right? So the premier in Ontario sort of scaled back on some EV rebates, unfortunately, once he was elected. So there was less of that. But even for myself, depending on the connection, not even the connections, but like if you're able to sort of leverage the budgets that are set aside for provincial governments and federal governments, one of the projects that I secured, I'm not going to talk too much about it because it's still kind of down the pipeline. I don't work at Lion anymore, but I was able to prepare a project scope for one client and get over $300,000 from one provincial government. That wasn't really even an official program. It was just, this is money that we have set aside in our budget. If you want to access it, then send us a project scope. And depending on the nature of the project, we can provide you with funding if it sort of aligns with what we're trying to fund. So that was really exciting. So you can either just apply to official programs. You could talk to the utility. Sometimes they have funding available or funding set aside for projects like these. Or you can actually just look at a government's budget or a jurisdiction's budget, see what they have set aside for different types of innovation funds, different types of grid stabilization funds, whatever, and then be able to sort of directly contact them and see if you can access that funding either through a grant program that they already have out, or you could just send them, a project scope directly and see if they'd be able to award you with that funding.
This is a great spot for me to plug Clean Start's work with supporting companies on going after grants. Always talk to your local grant agencies. They have money. They have to spend it. They don't get bonus for not spending money. So go out, talk to your local air board, the CEC. And in Sacramento, we're lucky enough to have a municipally owned utility as in SMUD, who, because they're, run by elected officials, they always want to know, how can they achieve specifically their 2030 zero emissions goals. And a lot of that they see as being in distributed energy resources microgrids, which includes vehicle to grid. So what's something that you think utilities that has worked for utilities supporting vehicle to grid, and what's something you wish, they would do more to support vehicle to grid?
To go,
This is a good time to request because they are curious. They want to know.
Oh yeah, total. Yeah, great question. To kind of go back with the EPA, just real quick, the EPA was a huge part of our U.S. funding round, and I also just want to clarify a utility statement that was made earlier. Um, but the EPA, we had several EPA rounds, and they provided up to $20,000 per infrastructure. That wasn't necessarily for V2G; it was just general infrastructure. And every utility out here in California, I mentioned they have their own make ready programs. They all have additional rebates for chargers. So you get $20,000 from the EPA. This is how round 1, 2, and 3 was set up, and then you'll get like a 50% charger rebate usually from the utility. So there's additional tax incentives and rebates that we kind of stack together, to actually make the project more feasible. Going back to the cost on the V2G, $20,000 per charger isn't enough to install V2G hardware. It's just not, right. Telus was developing a 30 kilowatt V2G charger that was somewhat in the ballpark of what a 24 kilowatt DC wall box would be, but still, even then. So one of the biggest hurdles is just having affordable charging hardware, right. So that's one thing I would fix. It's not really a utility question, but I think when that hurdle is overcome, a lot of other hurdles will be easier to overcome. As far as what the utilities can do, most utilities out here in California, the pilot projects we've had for V2G, they're usually under the ELRP program, Emergency Load Reduction Program, and California utilities have been offering around $2 a kilowatt. I've seen kind of roughly. So that's kind of some base metrics. They could increase that, right, or change up times of use, and make interconnection agreements easier. Those are maybe some suggestions I would have that the utility can do. But Vanessa, do you have any other ideas?
Yeah, I just wanted to add. So a lot of the times with utilities, it's usually you'll get funding through a bid. So they send out a bid and they're like, okay, we're looking for 6 chargers to complete this, to fulfill this project that we're looking at for distributed energy resource, for example. The challenge at Lion that I found, because I was, one of the main people who would sort of apply for these bids, is that it was usually emphasized on the infrastructure, but then when it came to subsidizing the buses, for example, there wasn't really anything offered by the utility. So I think that could be another challenge. At that point, it's like, okay, well, you have this funding that you can apply to the utility for infrastructure, but then you might have to apply to a different grant for the buses, right? So, and I'm not saying that happened all the time. Sometimes utilities did offer, okay, we could provide funding to a fleet operator as well to buy the buses, but I found that sometimes that wasn't really the case. So I think that was another challenge as well. It was just infrastructure, and like Kacy said, sometimes it wasn't even enough to cover, even half of what it would cost for the DC chargers.
Yeah, funding was the biggest hurdle, right? And that's why I was excited about that ZESB round. Well, $95,000 per charger, every school is going to have V2G, right? And I'm going to make a strong case with every school I have have a meeting with, right? You have to do this, right? Because you can turn those buses into assets during the summer, open up additional revenue streams, resilience, even if you don't want to sell it back to the grid, right? If you get storage batteries, you can maybe power the school when there's a power outage, depending on how many buses you have, right? I mean, that's a lot of power. When you start talking about bus fleets, even the American Transportation, that was 20 buses, but it was going to be about 2.5 megawatts. There's these schools back east that have hundreds of buses in their fleet. So you mentioned the V2G project in Oakland, which that is the Zoom project. They have 2,000 buses in the Bay Area, right? So you can really see how big of an impact that potentially has. It's just kind of working through all these issues.
Yeah, it's like California, I think, has over 2,000 or 25,000 school buses. And back of the envelope, that's well over, potentially 3 gigawatt hours of storage, which could be used there. So, I mean, with, there's some additional funding coming on. How fast do you see this potential transition to electric buses and to hopefully vehicle to grid with the buses happening? Do you see us having, almost most electric school buses by 2050, or just a fraction of them? How do you see this transition kind of unfolding?
I think every electric vehicle will be V2G capable at some point, right? Yeah, commercial and uh, it really depends on the use case, but I would imagine most, especially all school buses for sure, right? And it just depends on the use case as far as the residential use case goes. But the ball, like having heard of V2G in 2016, having come on with Lion 3 years ago, the ball is just moving very slow, right? It's progressing, but at how fast of a rate? I think funding has a huge part to do with that. Going back to that ZESB round, hey, now we can actually realistically implement all this stuff, right? If every school that wins buses can implement V2G, now that's a big step forward in my mind, right? And so I was hoping to really kind of get the ball moving even more. It's a slow process, right? A lot of these utilities, the utilities on the West Coast are far ahead of the game. The ones in California, when you start going back east, like I said, it's going to, usually stuff starts in California and it goes back in a wave, 5-10 years, and it'll make its way back east. I've seen that in other trends. But just my opinion.
Vanessa?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of momentum, sort of, I guess piggybacking off of what Kacy said, but also what our former boss Chris, he was a huge visionary, like I said, and I definitely think there's a lot of potential for V2G. Our buses at Lion, it was capable of discharging 40 kilowatts per hour. So it can discharge for 2 hours, so that's around 90 kilowatts. If you just have 10 of those buses or 11 of those buses, that's basically a megawatt. So imagine full fleets of vehicles where they're operating hundreds of buses. I think there's a lot of interest, and even here in Canada, like I said, I operate out of Ontario, where there's not really any sort of government policies incentivizing it. There's actually subsidies on diesel, and then there's not really any rebates for EVs. But even then, we've had so many applicants in Ontario who, like I said, one client wants 1,000 electric buses from Lion. We just won 200. There's a lot of school boards. There's a lot of fleet operators who are very interested in adopting electric vehicles, and I think see the potential. And even our project out in BC, it was for a private company who does tourism. They wanted to acquire electric school buses. So there's a lot of momentum towards it. What it depends on a lot of the times is, are there the right policies in place to help incentivize them? And is there the right funding opportunities? I really hope that, in light of some of, the changes that are taking place, and some of the issues with climate change, for example, and some of our ambitious targets of, we want to halve greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and then be net zero by 2050. I really hope that we can have wide scale EV adoption, basically get it to full EV adoption for BSBs by 2050, because I think there definitely is a big value proposition for that, and especially to improve grid resiliency as well, and be able to utilize a generation asset during times of the day where the buses aren't operating, because there are times where they're sitting idle during the day as well as in the summer. So I'm really hoping that, yes, depending on, who's politically, what that's going to look like, what the landscape will be, that there will be EV adoption. Just a lot of the times that's a very big force that comes into play. So I think just being cognizant of that. But if there's other sources of funding that we can leverage, like utilities, for example, they're super forward thinking, some of them, and they offer sort of DER programs and funding for those, then so be it. Then we could take advantage for sure. But I think there's a lot of interest. Just in the year and a half that I was at Lion, I could tell that it was definitely moving in that direction for sure.
Well, I agree. And I think, like you said, it's the landscape. So I always want to highlight right here in Sacramento, we've, Lions here with doing work. And from the Capitol, where a lot of the legislation's made, you can easily drive to CAISO, the California Independent Systems Operator. Their resources board is here, along with an air district that helped get Tesla semis to Pepsi distribution here. The CEC is here, along with SMUD, which is a utility that works really hard to engage with its constituents and has a net zero by 2030 goal. So if you want to, experiment or engage and build something really cool, I think there's a lot of good stuff right here in Sacramento, not to mention, we've got a lot of breweries and wineries right next to us. So it's a lot of fun with that. Now we're coming up on the hour. I want to offer you both a chance to say some last thoughts on this, and then we'll wrap it up.
Go, Vanessa.
Yeah, I'm really excited and hopeful. Not just even hopeful, but I feel like I know intuitively that as we continue to, move through time, that sort of the goals of, Paris Climate Agreement get cemented, that there is, like I said, a lot of potential for V2G adoption, and just electrification as a whole. And I think that having V2G and vehicle to grid programs and technologies in place will sort of help further incentivize the electrification of vehicles, because obviously cost, like Kacy and I mentioned, is a huge factor. For the hardware, it can be expensive, and also just BESBs are typically way more expensive than a diesel bus. However, there is less maintenance, usually 60% less maintenance costs associated with BESBs. So although it may seem like a higher upfront cost at first, and usually it is, over time it definitely pays off. And especially if you have something that can provide sort of a generation asset or an energy asset and be able to store energy onto it and then discharge and potentially generate revenue, for a lot of these fleet operators and companies, I think there's a big value proposition and use case. And I'm really hopeful and excited to see where this industry goes.
Yeah, I appreciate everybody's time. I enjoyed giving this presentation. Hopefully I can continue to work with grid integration. And I'm working with a really awesome recruiter from the California Energy Commission. Since I closed the bidirectional grant here this last year, I'm hoping to join their team. So I'm working hard to hopefully make that happen. And yeah, hopefully to keep working on grid integration in the future and everything EV related. And excited to be here in Sacramento. Actually live in Rescue if you're local, up towards Placerville. So excited to be somewhat local and be able to meet Thomas and the Clean Start staff in Sacramento.
All right. Thank you for that. And I also want to mention we have another resource here, the California Mobility Center, that has roots actually with its CEO coming from Lion Electric. That's Orville Thomas doing a lot of great work here. So I want to thank Vanessa and Kacy Marrs for joining us. I want to thank everyone who logged in to attend, even Carl, who I called on suddenly, and also some of the great discussion I see there by George Miller. I want to thank our supporters. Again, that's SMUD, our local utility, Bloom Co-working, Fresno State, the Wet Center, River City Bank, which you want to see vehicle grid take off. Let's work with River City Bank to make the projects bankable, which can make them just explode like Yieldco's did back in the day. And Chico Start, which is actually having their Grow Tech Fest coming up this November. So check out Chico Start for their Grow Tech Fest. And with that, thank you. Oh, we have two other things coming in: Innovation in Wind later this month, our circular economy discussion on September 26th, and navigating environmental regulations with Sacramento County on October 8th. Thank you for attending. Connect with us. Check out our YouTube channel. We have lots of these discussions. Also LinkedIn, Facebook, and apparently we're on Instagram, even though I'm not there. Thank you all for attending, and have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Phil.